Thank you for joining me for this virtual opening mind session. I want to talk today about the song that you've just heard. We sing it regularly as a college community, but have you ever paused to think what you're singing about? Who might have written it? Or the story behind it? To find out more about those questions, we need to explore the life of a poet and the time that he was living in. But before we start thinking about that, what do you think you already know about Jerusalem? Well, it was written by, or at least the words were written by William Blake, but the music, that was added much later by Hubert Parry. It's sung in school halls, churches and at sporting events up and down the country, but you might know it as the official anthem of the Women's Institute. You might have heard it was banned by the Dean of Southwark Cathedral in 2008. It probably makes you think of tea and crumpets, victory in Europe, the soft thump of leather on willow. That's cricket, for those of you drawing a blank on that one. Red phone boxes, the last night of the proms, flag waving. In short, it's a rousing anthem that represents everything that is English. However, the story behind Jerusalem is somewhat more complex. And I need to start by introducing the man who wrote the words, William Blake. William Blake was born in London into a lower middle class, reasonably affluent family of religious dissenters who were involved in some quite radical politics. He was a poet, a painter, an engraver, a printmaker. He was also a very liberal thinker. He believed in freedom and equality for the sexes, for different races, for individuals. He was largely unrecognised during his lifetime as an artist, but he's now considered to be an influential figure in both the poetry and the art of the Romantic Age. His poetry was deceptively simple, highly expressive, philosophical, and even mystical. He believed that he was ahead of his time, and he felt misunderstood by society. In fact, no one really read his poetry while he was alive. Blake didn't mind that because he felt that he produced his work for God and to benefit future generations. And he's certainly right on one of those assumptions, at least, because he's still very much admired and studied today in classrooms and universities and enjoyed by people who enjoy reading poetry and visiting art galleries and so on. He was an absolutely fascinating individual, and if he was born today, he might be considered to be eccentric. We might even say that he was delusional. When he was 8 years old, William Blake claimed to have seen a tree filled with angels, with bright angelic wings decorating every branch like stars. And he claimed to see this upon Peckham Rye, not too far from where the college is. Of course, at the time, Peckham Rye was rural, it was just fields. But anyway, he continued to have these visions for the rest of his life. As a poet and an artist, he was highly individual. He was largely self-taught, and that's very different to a lot of the other Romantic poets, or the poets that we know as Romantic poets, his contemporaries like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Byron, perhaps Burns up in Scotland. They tended to be more not Burns actually, they tended to be more educated. Wordsworth, Coleridge went to Cambridge, for example. Blake himself, he started writing poetry when he was about 12 years old. And he didn't actually go to school. He was self-taught by his homeschooled by his mother. And at the age of 14, he was apprenticed to a London engraver because he'd shown a particular talent for drawing. So, as an engraver, His job was to copy designs onto metal plates so that they could be reproduced. It did require some artistic skill, but it wasn't really seen as a creative art form in itself. It was a long apprenticeship, it was 7 years, and Blake excelled at his craft. He actually invented a new engraving technique called relief engraving. Of course, being William Blake, he firmly believed that it was his dead brother that had taught him the new method in a dream. Using this new method, he began to develop his own artistic form of producing engravings that contained both the text of his poems and his artwork, something that hadn't really been done in this way in the past. The techniques that he used required an incredible amount of patience and skill. If I just show you one of his examples here, this is a poem that you may well know called The Tiger. And if you look at the image there, that's how he produced all of his poems. And what he would do, he would work on a piece of copper, on a copper plate, and he'd paint the image or the outline of the image onto this copper plate, and he'd paint the text on there using a wax. To write the text, what he actually had to do is to learn to write in mirror writing. So he had to write backwards. What he'd then do is apply an acid which would eat away at all the unwanted copper, leaving a raised surface from which he could print these manuscripts. From there, he'd add layers of watercolour paint to finish these images, and then he bound them together as volumes of poetry. This particular poem comes from probably his most famous work, called Songs of Innocence and Experience, which is a collection of about 45 of these plates. You can imagine how long it takes to produce just one of them, and he was very insistent that this was how his work should be seen by people. So he didn't produce very many complete manuscripts in his lifetime. Possibly one of the reasons that he wasn't particularly widely read at the time. And I think it's always really important for us to see the manuscripts as he intended them to be produced, rather than just the text on a white piece of paper, because what you see in the image there is this really close relationship between the image and the text, and it reflects this relationship between humanity and nature, which he often explores in his poetry, and that is best seen in this poem. Probably the one that you're most likely to know after Jerusalem, of course, often taught in primary schools and to younger children. And it's deceptively simple in the imagery, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's so powerful. Let me read it. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hands dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain? In what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? So like I said, it's deceptively simple, that poem. On the surface of it, you've got this majestic and powerful animal who lives in the dangerous and unknown forests of the night. But there also seems to be a fear of the being that could create such a monstrous animal. He asks this question, which is effectively, how could a benevolent God create a creature as terrifying as this tiger? And he skillfully asks this question through that series of rhetorical questions throughout the poem. If you look at how the tiger seems twisted, almost forged in the furnace. I mean, it's clear this isn't really a poem about a tiger. It's more about a representation, I think, of God's power, captured in the ability of nature to create both awe and terror in humans. Blake was widely respected by his peers. Wordsworth said of him, William Wordsworth, the well-known romantic poet, he said, "There was no doubt that this poor man was mad. But there's something in the madness of this man which interests me more than the sanity of Lord Byron and Walter Scott." Blake also moved in some quite influential circles. He was a friend, or an acquaintance at least, of Thomas Paine, the Enlightenment philosopher, probably best known for the rights of man, as a supporter of the French Revolution and an opponent to hereditary monarchy. And Blake was a bit of a rebel all his life as well. He actually got arrested in 1803. Just before Jerusalem was written, actually, Jerusalem's 1804, on a charge of sedition, which is threatening the state. He allegedly got into a fight with a police officer and said, "Damn the king," as he was being dragged away. Blake was clearly a man who was confident in his own ideas, and he relied on his own ideas rather than accepting the ideas of others. And what were the ideas of the time? Well, Blake lived through the tail end of the Enlightenment period. That was a time where science and rationalism were prominent ideas which were being widely discussed. Ideas about how governments should operate and what society should look like were being developed and discussed, and the influence of the church was diminishing. The English Civil War in 1650 had begun to make people question the role of the monarchy and the concept of the divine right of the king. So around this time, logic becomes much more important than imagination for philosophical thinkers like John Locke and for scientists like Isaac Newton. And it's this aspect of Enlightenment philosophy that Blake's got quite a complex relationship with. He's really strongly attracted to the concepts of liberty and freedom, but his advocation of the imagination as the most important element of human existence runs contrary to the Enlightenment ideals of rationalism. So as a result of that, he's more closely associated with the ideas of the Romantic period. That begins in around 1789 as a result of two revolutions. The ideals of freedom, equality and fraternity that characterised the French Revolution were spreading through Europe, and they became symbols of this romantic movement. Within the movement, there's this spirit of rebellion, because the Romantics were challenging the ideas that society could control the individual, could control creativity, and could control imagination. These Romantics, I've mentioned already Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, Byron, Burns. They're reacting to the logic and rationalism of the Enlightenment by trying to revive this connection to feeling and imagination, and that's especially through their poetry. So I've mentioned one revolution, the French Revolution, and I did say that there were two that had an impact on the Romantic era. And the other one of those is the Industrial Revolution, which is something that you might have talked about in history lessons. The world changed rapidly around this time with the invention of new powered machinery. It was from about late 1760s. Around this time, factories are being built and mass production is beginning. The Industrial Revolution created wealth like never before and distributed it more widely as well. But it also created poverty and deprivation on a scale that has never been seen before. Cities became more crowded as people moved from the rural areas to find employment, like at places like the Albion Mill on the slide there, which was a industrial bakery on the Blackfriars Bridge, believed to be the type of mill, possibly the mill that Blake's referring to in Jerusalem, the dark satanic mills. And we even see widespread use of children at work at this time, which for them is a real loss of their innocence, and they gain this kind of grim experience of what the world is prepared to do to them, how awful the world is for these poor, these children who are living in poverty. And this was really starkly seen in London. Blake was a Londoner, and London was a dark and violent place in the late 18th century. Londoners were rioting against a variety of social problems, including the deprivation that had been caused by industrialisation. Blake had mixed feelings about the city. He called it a human, awful wonder of God. We see this really powerfully in his poem London, which is also from Songs of Innocence and Experience. He presents us with London as a place of nightmare in this poem. I wandered through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, a mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear, how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. You can see there the engraving that Blake produced for this poem that appeared in Songs of Experience. So we've got this nightmare city. You might suggest that this poem's really relevant today because of the way that it exposes the gulf between those in power and the misery of the poor people. I want to start just by drawing your attention in this poem to the metaphor in the second stanza, the mind-forged manacles I hear. That's sort of the key part to understanding what this poem's about. It's an allusion there to the Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said that man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. And what Blake's suggesting here in London is that those manacles are mind-forged. They come from the ideas that are imposed upon us by authority. Interestingly, you see in the word forged and a link perhaps there back to the tiger, and the way that the tiger's created. I think what Blake's saying here, though, is it's humans, people that oppress other people. And that's what he's talking about at the beginning of the poem in stanza 1 when he talks about the chartered streets. Now, a charter is a kind of contract which is given to wealthy people and organisations, and it gives them the rights to control the streets of London. But Blake's saying here that even the Thames is chartered, and he's showing an irony there that that the people in charge feel like they're in control enough to pass a law to control the river. as if that's also property of the state, suggesting that these people think they're more powerful than nature. We've already seen in the tiger how Blake considers what Blake thinks about the power of God and the power of nature. So for humans to think that they can control that shows a real shows that Blake has been really critical here of those in charge. He's suggesting that ordinary people just lack freedoms in this city. But it gets worse. In stanza 2, you can see that clearly people have given in to the woe or the misery that's been inflicted on them by the city. We hear the fearful cries of every man and even every infant. That repetition of every shows that no one is benefiting from the conditions that have been imposed upon them in the city. And then you've got this criticism of the church. It's literally blackened with the soot that is in the city, but it's also metaphorically blackened with the shame that it's not doing anything to help the people. It's not doing anything about the conditions in the city. It's interesting here this criticism of the church, because Blake believes in God. He's very religious, but he didn't have very much time for organised religion, and that's quite an important point. So the conditions of these cities were fermenting some of the revolutionary ideas that had been spreading in France at around this time, and the British establishment are absolutely terrified. So they begin to implement some harsh laws to control the population, such as the Treason Act in 1975, and that limited freedom of speech and expression. Think of those mind-forged manacles. Britain's been at war for most of Blake's lifetime, and they even go to war against France in 1795 as a distraction from the conditions that the people are living under, and as a distraction from the French Revolution. The image in the poem here of the hapless soldier is quite striking. The description of blood on the palace walls suggests that Blake's warning that a revolution might not be far away in England if something isn't done about the poverty and distress of the ordinary working people. But I think the most distressing image in this poem is perhaps the youthful harlot bringing a child into the world, continuing this cycle of moral deterioration. And is it right that people are being forced to live in this way? Blake seems to be asking us some very topical ideas in this poem, I think, to today. So this kind of brings us back round to Jerusalem. How have the words of William Blake, a religious dissenter, an anti-establishmentarian, a madcap poet, a liberal freethinker, how have those words become synonymous with English establishmentarianism? The poem Jerusalem itself was published in 1804, but it remained fairly obscure until 1916, when Hubert Parry set it to the tune that we all know for an organisation called Fight for Right, who campaigned to boost the morale of soldiers during World War I. It very quickly became well loved, and it was adopted by the women's suffrage movement, and then as the anthem for the Women's Institute in 1924, and they still sing it today at their meetings. It's sung on the last night of the proms, at the end of the Labour Party conference, as the anthem for English Rugby League and English cricket, and we of course sing it regularly in our Great Hall. But we rarely pay much attention to the lyrics, and I think they're fascinating and they're worth looking at a bit more closely. The poem refers to the apocryphal story of Joseph of Arimathea, Jesus' uncle, who might have brought a young Jesus to England on a trading visit. He did those feet in ancient times, walk upon England's mountains green. So the premise is that if Jesus came to England for that short time, then symbolically at least, England was a kind of Jerusalem, a holy land. So Blake ends his poem by raising the possibility that England could become the new Jerusalem, which is mentioned in the book of Revelation, and that it's every Englishman's duty to labour until we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. But the problem I have with that interpretation is it doesn't quite fit with the William Blake that I've been describing. He wasn't a great fan of the national institutions of the state and church, and I'm not sure that he'd want to see them restored to glory. And the reference to dark satanic mills doesn't seem to evoke a sense of national pride that we know the poem and the song for. And the problem with the Joseph story is there's not very much historic evidence to support it. I mean, the people of Glastonbury would probably disagree. That's where he is alleged to have visited. But Blake probably knew that the story didn't have much truth in it. It's believed to have originated sometime around the 13th century, long after any of the events are supposed to have happened. So, if we read it through the context of the poet, I see Jerusalem as a poem that represents a struggle for human, not for national identity, and for a desire to see social change as this kind of shared enterprise. And I think that reading works if you take the idea of Jerusalem as representing freedom or spiritual liberty, and Blake's setting out to be a prophet, warning people that something has to be done about the country if it is to be saved from the owners of the dark satanic mills. So as a man who was imprisoned by the state that he consistently rallied against, I bet Blake would be at least surprised that he's become such a symbol of national pride. Or that this song has become such a symbol of national pride. There are some in the Church of England who don't see Jerusalem as a hymn because it's not a celebration to the glory of God, or they suggest that it's too violent, so they don't allow it to be used in celebrations. There are those, as I've said, that question the veracity or the truth of the myth that it's based upon. And arguably, when it's being belted out by 20,000 Yorkshiremen and women at Headingley, most of the comprehension of it is lost anyway. But does all this really matter? I don't think it does. Because whatever the meaning is behind the words, the ideas of freedom and individuality and the values of creativity and compassion that inspired William Blake are what I think about when I sing it. And these couldn't be more appropriate or fitting things for you to consider next time we come together as a community to sing it in our great hall. Thank you very much for listening.